Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the transmission of the text from the Old and New Testament. But first I want to look at some scriptures where God promises to preserve His Word. Isaiah 48 is probably the most well-known verse concerning this. It says, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." Similarly, Isaiah 55:11 says, "So shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose. It shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it." Psalm 119:89 says, "Forever, O Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens." Matthew 24:35 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away." And 1 Peter 1:24 through 25 quotes from Isaiah 40 saying, "For all grass and all of its glory, like grass and the grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever." And this word is the good news that was preached to you, speaking of the gospel. So when we think about the word, we're thinking about not only the written word, but the gospel that was proclaimed that has changed our lives. And that word was written down and then faithfully transmitted over thousands of years, and we have received it in the Bible today. So today our discussion is going to be around this reception of the word from its original sources to the Bibles that we have now. The Old Testament is a fascinating story as much as the New Testament. The key difference to remember with the Old Testament is it's a story of quality. By quality, we're talking about the quality of the text as it was transmitted from its original documents to the sources that we have today. It all started with the original law being given around 1500 BC by Moses. This would have been the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this is called the Pentateuch. And it was written by Moses and then was transmitted through the ages to some time to where it was almost lost. In 2 Kings chapter 22, Josiah made some reforms to go back to the original faith that the Jews had. They had apostated and gone and worshipped other gods. But Josiah, wanting to restore this, found a copy of the Word, the only remaining copy that was in existence at that time, and they read it aloud. So Josiah, reading that Word, decided to make some drastic changes in Israel to go back to the faith that had been handed down to them. And this happened around 600 BC. From that time, the law and the prophets and the Psalms and the wisdom literature were all collated by scribes such as Ezra. So at the time of Ezra and before Ezra and after Ezra, there were prophets that were writing things down, and they were being collated into what later became the Old Testament. So the law was already really considered scripture, and much of the wisdom literature was at the time. The prophets were becoming that way, and many of the Psalms were. It wasn't until sometime after Ezra that the actual adoption of what was canon in the Old Testament happened, and we'll talk about that later. But it was around this time that they were collating this to form what would become the Old Testament. From there, the scriptures are widely circulated, and this is where we got a lot of the various translations and variations of the Pentateuch. We had the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these were widely circulated from 300 BC to AD 70. So it was a time where the Old Testament really flourished and had a lot of copies and had wide circulation, not only in Israel, but abroad as well. From there, we get the destruction of the temple and the Jewish diaspora. So the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and the Jews were spread out all over the Roman Empire, and with them they took the texts that they had, and they would take those to wherever they settled in the Roman Empire, wherever they were relocated to. Some of those were buried, some of them which we would later dig up, but other texts were preserved, and the rabbinical community at that time coalesced around a set of texts that would become what became the Masoretic text around the late 1st century. Sometime after that, the scriptures remained intact as they were, and but they were copied meticulously, and they developed practices and habits for preserving those scriptures in the form that they have, so there wouldn't be any errors introduced into those texts. And these habits were codified at some point by the Masoretes. And the Masoretes were a school of scribes that were very meticulous about copying the Hebrew scriptures, and they came up with the vowel pointings as well. And what they would do is they would literally try to copy things a letter at a time without looking at the words. They would look at a letter and copy the letter, copy the letter, copy the letter, without actually trying to see or read what was being said in the text. It was actually like literally one text, one piece of letter at a time. Write it down, look at the next, write that one down, so as to discipline themselves so they wouldn't introduce things into the text that weren't there. And so this meticulous copying happened over a period of 500 years from whenever the Masoretes formed till we got to what was considered the last or the latest extant or the copy of what we have in the Old Testament, and that's the Leningrad Codex. And the Leningrad Codex dates to about A.D. 1000 or around 1008, and it's probably the earliest manuscript that we had prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fascinating thing about the Leningrad Codex and what is contained in it and what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the remarkable similarities between these texts over a period of almost 1100 years. So if you can think about what was written and preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then what was copied manually by hand over a period of 1,000 years being almost identical, shows the meticulous nature of what the Masoretes did and the heritage that they inherited from the rabbis before them about the discipline they had in preserving the texts of the Old Testament. In fact, the Isaiah scroll, the complete Isaiah scroll, is nearly identical to the one found in the Leningrad Codex. And that's a really significant find, because prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there really weren't any extant copies of the Old Testament. But this discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls affirms what we do read about in the Masoretic histories concerning the preservation of God's Word. The New Testament is a fascinating story as well. With the Old Testament, we saw a progressive transmission of the text, where you had one generation that would hand it off to the next generation, and it was certainly a lot more linear, and they were very meticulous about doing it letter by letter. That's not what happened with the New Testament. The New Testament is a story of many manuscripts and early manuscripts, so we see a lot of manuscripts that were produced, and they were very early to the date of the original writings. And this is a lot different way of preserving the text, but nonetheless it did preserve it, and we're fairly confident that we have what we have in our Bibles today is very close, if not exactly the same as what they had when they originally wrote it. So here's the story of the New Testament and what happened there. As we know, around AD 30, Jesus died, he was buried, he resurrected, and then he had his ascension. And his ascension into heaven was followed by the events of the early church, and that's when it got started in Jerusalem. Somewhere around 20 years after that, we see the composition of the New Testament begin. So within 20 years after Jesus's ascension into heaven is when the New Testament had commenced its writing. So that would have been some of the early Gospels like Mark, and then some of the early epistles, some of the Paul's epistles, and it wrapped up around AD 90 with the writing of Revelation. Now, after the composition of the New Testament was complete, the works of the New Testament were shared among the churches. So what would happen is they would take the letters that had been written to that, say Galatians, and they would share that with another church. So they would copy it and then share it with another church. And then this practice of sharing among churches is really how the New Testament was preserved in its earliest forms. Now, it would be impossible to say that any one church had what we call the New Testament today in its entirety at that time. But among the churches, we can say that the New Testament did exist in its entirety. There weren't thousands of churches at that time, and they were a lot more homogeneous because they were very close to the original church that was founded in Jerusalem. And from this period, we have fragments, and the earliest fragments date to around, within 30 to 40 years of the actual composition of the book. And that's pretty remarkable for any ancient document. And we'll see that in a comparison I'll show you in a minute. About 80 to 50, though, is the earliest full book of the New Testament that we have. And that's pretty significant as well. You might think that's not, but it's within 100 to 150 years of the composition of the original work. For an ancient document, that's very remarkable. So that tells us that we have full books emerging around 3rd century AD, but we have much earlier fragments than that, as we've seen already. And from there, we get the earliest full copy of the New Testament around AD 325. Now, at this period in church history, and there's a lot going on, this is where a lot of the early church councils were deciding about some of the core doctrines that we have in Christianity. They were really trying to figure out Christology, what it meant for God to be a man, what is the doctrine of the Trinity, and things like that. They were trying to get really understand what these things meant, and they were having a lot of discourse and letter writing and councils and meetings to iron out some of the details and then codify that into creeds and so on like that. Also, politically, this was a very tumultuous time for Christianity as well, because Christianity was emerging from the movement and a religion that was kind of off the grid, or it was kind of not a major religion to becoming the major religion in the Roman Empire at the time, and becoming the official religion of the state at that time. And it was at that time where it was adopted, and it was starting to be spread not only by missionary effort, but by in a lot of ways, government decrees and things like that, which has a blessing and a curse depending on how you look at it. But regardless of how you see it, it had implications on the history of the New Testament by what happened next, because they wanted the Roman Empire to have copies of the New Testament. Large numbers of the New Testament were produced because of this. And so they used the method that they used to copy official documents to copy the New Testaments. They had these things called scriptoriums, which were essentially an auditorium of sort, where you had a person who would read a document, and you have scribes who would then copy down or write down what they heard. And this was how the texts were produced in large numbers. So you'd have one guy reading and multiple people writing things down. And these scribes didn't have the good habits that the Masoretes had, where they copied it one letter at a time, because they were hearing it and writing it down. Likewise, in the Greek language, things like spelling weren't standard. There was no word order, wasn't important. And so this habit of copying text in this manner introduced a lot of variance into the text. So this is where we end up with a lot of the variance that we observe in the New Testament manuscripts that we do have today. And most of the variants that are in the New Testament have to do, like as I mentioned, are spelling, things with spelling and things with word order. And these kinds of things don't change meaning, or they don't change anything about the content of the text. In a few rare instances, the words are inserted or omitted, but by and large, it's mostly those things about word order and spelling variations in the text. From here, we see the text transmitted much in the same way over a long period of time, and they kept producing more and more and more, and you see it was some variations of and almost regional variations emerge. You had some in the West, you had some in Africa, you had some in the Eastern Roman Empire, and these textual traditions became the foundation of what we have in our modern Bibles today. So modern biblical studies take all of these texts that were produced in large numbers, and they collate them. They get the facsimiles, essentially images of them, and then they look for the variants, and then they study them very closely to figure out where the variants are. And then from this, they take into consideration how old the text is, where it came from, and a lot of other variables, and they extrapolate from the plurality of text what the original text probably said, and then they produce a book, essentially a New Testament, that is called the Nestle Aland 28th edition, or the UBS text, whichever one you prefer. And that work of textual scholars is the foundation for most of our modern Bible translations. This table shows the New Testament in light of many other ancient documents that have been written, and it gives you an idea of just how well the New Testament is preserved. So take, for instance, Homer's Iliad here. It was written around 900 BC, and the earliest copies that are known to exist are from about 400 BC. So the difference between when it was written and the earliest copies would be around 500 years. Likewise, the number of manuscripts for the Iliad numbers to around 643. So that is the second most well-preserved document that we know to exist. By comparison, the New Testament was written around 50 to 90 AD, and the earliest copies were from about 120 AD. So within 30 years or so of when it was written, we have some documents from the New Testament, and the number of documents are around 5,800 documents. That is a factor of almost 9 over the Iliad. So you can see here, by comparison, the second most well-preserved ancient document against the New Testament is pretty paltry at best. The next one is really not even close to even the Iliad, and much more far cry from even the New Testament. So when you take the New Testament and compare it to other ancient sources for other documents that are known to exist, you can see that it has been preserved orders of magnitude over other sources. So whenever somebody is trying to suggest that the New Testament isn't reliable, or it's got errors, or it's been copied and we don't really know what it says, the argument that is based on is ignorance, because in reality, because we do have so many sources, and we have so many early sources, we can interpolate from that what the original manuscripts would have said, and we can say with high confidence that what we do have in the New Testament has been preserved, and that we can trust that what is written is what the author wrote and what he intended to write in the New Testament.